For our winter landscape scene, we are going to create a sunset. By doing this, we're going to use watercolors. So you'll need your tray, water, and a paintbrush. I also have a spray bottle that if you need to re-wet your paper later on afterwards, you can, but it's totally optional. The first step is going to be to wake up all of your rainbow colors. So we have 6. We have our 3 warm colors and our 3 cool colors, and I'm just rinsing my brush in between each, and I'm gently waking them up so that each color has a small puddle of color in the bottom. Once I have done this, I'm going to rinse out my brush really good, and I'm going to start to just put water on my paper. And notice that I'm trying to keep my paper down as I'm wetting it. I got a little bit of paint extra from my messy mat on there, but I'm just wetting the bottom 1/3 or 1/4 of my paper. The first color I'm going to start with is red, and I'm going to do a fairly thick section of red because I'm going to end up putting some paper on my background here, and I want to still be able to see my red. So my red section is going to be kind of thick. My next color I'm going to add is orange, and you'll notice that this watercolor is traveling through the water. That's what we want. We want our colors to not necessarily be stripes, but a seamless movement of color from each one to the next. So I want them to blend just a little. After I've done that with my orange, I'm going to rinse out my brush, and I'm going to add more water at the top to paint the next 2 colors of my rainbow. So I'm going to paint yellow. And yellow is the hardest one because it tends to pick up the other colors very easily, so it tends to look a little bit more yellow-orange. So if you need to go back and add more yellow on later on, you can. So my next color I'm going to do is green, and you can see that my color is starting to travel up my paper. So I've got green here, and it'll probably mix a little bit with my yellow, so I've got some green-yellow going on. But I'm going to do my green section here. After it dries, you can always go back and add a little bit more color like I did here with my yellow, because I want my yellow to be bright, and the yellow is the one that tends to fade out the easiest. Okay, so I've rinsed my brush, add more clear water onto the top. You can see my green is starting to travel up my page, and I'm going to add my blue. I love watching these watercolors travel through the water. They just kind of blend and kind of bleed in through the water, and it's a really cool looking effect. And then the last color at the top of my paper, this is my last section here, is going to be my purple. And I've tried to keep each section of my colors about the same size. My red might be a little bit bigger, but I'm trying to kind of make them equal. If you end up with a lot of extra space at the top of your paper, you're probably just going to end up with a large purple section, and that's perfectly fine. Not a worry, you don't need to restart. Some will end up with more of one color and less of another color, and that's totally fine. Now that my background is drying, I'm going to take a black piece of paper, and I'm going to take my tearing pincher fingers, and at the bottom of my paper, when it's turned tall and skinny, I'm going to tear a strip off at the bottom. I want it to keep that same straight edge at the bottom. This is going to be for the collected snow at the bottom of my paper. For the rest of my black paper, I'm going to first trim off the straight edge on the side, and then I'm going to start tearing strips from my piece of paper. And I'm going to take my time. I know it's sped up here, but I'm going to take my time, and I'm going to be very close to my tearing. I'm not just going to do one tear and try to rip down the whole length of my paper. I move my hands to be next to the tears that I'm making, and I'm going to end up tearing the entire rest of the strip of my paper. And the very last piece will be tearing off that straight edge. I don't want the straight edge except for the very bottom one. And I'm going to take that strip, and it should be the perfect width to fit at the bottom of my paper where the red was. So I'm going to put glue on. I know a lot of times when I say to glue, you only need a few sections. This is one of the exceptions to that rule. I try to make sure to put glue all along the bottom and each of those peaks, because it is a torn piece of paper and it tends to curl, and it just needs a little bit of extra help with some extra glue. Then I'm going to take the other strips of my paper, and I'm going to find one that I like that's usually thicker, and I'm going to try to make it into the tree trunk. And it's going to end up, you can either tuck it behind that, or I'm gonna end up laying mine in front because mine fit pretty good. But the straight edge of the end of my paper is gonna be at the very top. So we're gonna add glue all over to this piece to stick it on for our tree trunk. So the bottom part that we've already glued on, that's the snow collected on the ground. And then I'm going to add a tree trunk. And I'm gonna put it not right next to the edge of my paper, but I want a little bit of space. So I've got a big section of sky and a little section of sky. I'm gonna take my other torn pieces of paper, and these are going to be for branches. If your torn pieces of paper are really, really thick, you might want to tear them in half and make them a little bit skinnier so they look a little bit more like branches instead of tree trunks. If they hang off the edge of your paper, that's not a big deal. We're going to end up cutting those off, and you can actually use those cut off sections for different branches connected to branches, so your tree looks more realistic, like I'm doing here. I'm going to cut these off, and I'm going to end up using them. Notice that I'm putting branches on both sides of my tree, and I can add them on to different branches so that my tree looks as realistic as possible. Anything that hangs off the edge of your paper, you're going to end up cutting off. And the reason why we're using black for our paper is because our sun is setting in the background. And when the sun is setting, the light tends to disappear. So our tree is in the front, so it's in the foreground, and our tree is going to be in shadow. So that's why our tree is black, because it's in shadow. You can add 2 or 3 branches onto the side of your tree. You can add several, you can add just a couple. It is up to you. I like to have my tree be as interesting and as healthy as possible. So I like to have lots of branches, and I like to attach branches on. You can see here I'm tearing one in half to add on for branches coming off of a branch. You do not have to use all of the strips that you've torn off of your paper. Anything that's left over can just go into the trash. I had a little gap at the bottom of my tree trunk, so I took that little scrap of paper and I stuck it on there so that way my sky is not poking through my tree trunk. And when you're all finished, you'll have a beautiful tree in front of your setting sun. And we've trimmed off the edges, and we're gonna let this dry before we begin our next step. The last step of our sunset picture is going to be to add in a little bit of white snow. Now I know I said that our snow and our tree are in shadows, so I'm not really adding a lot of snow. What I'm doing with my white paint is at the very peaks of my snow, or any gaps where like a tree trunk meets a branch, that would be where snow is collected. And remember, our sun is not completely disappeared, it's setting, so there's still going to be a little bit of light. So this snow that I'm painting on is meant to represent a little bit of the snow that is just at the very top of our snow banks and our collected snow, and it's just got the sun just glistening just off the top of it. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm putting snow each place where the branches meet, and I'm kind of doing a little bit of a thick layer of snow. I'm not really painting it back and forth with my brush, but I'm using my brush more as like a dabbing motion so I can add on kind of a thicker layer of paint, because the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add on some glitter here, so that way our snow that has the sun shining off of it will glisten in the sun, kind of like that snow does when it's fallen. It glistens in the sunlight. So I'm just adding on some glitter here onto my snow, and that's why I wanted it to be kind of thicker, because I wanted my paint to be still wet when I went to add the glitter on. So I'm not glittering the whole paper, I'm just spooning it on to those certain spots where my snow is, and then I'm gonna dust it off inside my messy mat, and then I'll pour that glitter back in. We may have a different process in class, but we're still going to do something similar to this. We don't do glitter very often because it tends to get everywhere, but every now and then we need a little bit of glitter. Our last step is with our Q-tip, and I'm gonna take this Q-tip and I'm just gonna add in some snow in my sky, so that it looks like it's falling. The reason why I'm not adding it on my tree is because remember, my tree is in shadow. The only snow that we can see is the snow that's collected there and is glistening in the sun. The reason why we didn't add glitter to our falling snow is because our snow is falling. So it's not really had a chance to collect anywhere. So we're gonna add in snow falling in our sky using our Q-tip. And then our picture is finished.